Long ago, there was a time when if human beings saw a tree, in that day they saw a tree as we see a tree now, but they also saw a woodman. And if they encountered a bear, they saw what we see as bear, but they also saw a bear man. And if they came to a river like this one out here, shining under that sliver of a new moon rising on its western bank, if they saw that, they would see a waterman and a moon grandmother. And they could talk to these things. They shared a language with these things, and they could negotiate with these things around them in the world. That's how it was back then. But that was so long ago that in fact that time might lie in our future. And in that time, the Udege people lived along the tributaries to the great Amur River in far southeastern Siberia, a land of great taiga forests, a land of mountains and lakes and rivers, a land of the great Siberian tiger. And among the Udege people at that time, there were two brothers. The eldest was named Solomdiga, and the younger was named Indiga. Now it happened that these two young men's father had died, but before he died, he called them to him and he gave them some instructions. He said to the young men, he said, always stay together and watch over and protect one another. Each brother must protect the other brother. And also, when you walk in the world, you should always look in the same direction and not looking all around. And shortly after he had given them these final instructions, their father died. And the young men, as was their custom, plaited their father's hair in a white cloth. And they laid him in his grave with his feet pointing toward the east so that his spirit could see the sunrise each day. And after they had buried him, they brought to his grave food and tobacco and offerings of that kind to feed his spirit. And they did this for a period of 7 days, as was the custom of the Udege. But when that time was over, the young men said, now we must hunt. We must hunt, for our old widowed mother must eat. And so the two young men went out in the bush. They went out hunting, and this is how they went. Solomdiga, probably because he was the eldest and used to it, he took the lead. He walked ahead of Indiga. Now, as their father had told them, Solomdiga looked straight ahead. In fact, he looked about 7 paces ahead, and he had soft hunter's eyes looking for tracks and signs and things around him in the world. Indiga brought up the rear, but Indiga didn't like to look that way. Indiga had quick, nervous eyes, and he liked to look all around in many different directions. And while they were walking like this in the bush, from out of the undergrowth, a Siberian tiger charged. The tiger was closest to Solomdiga, so close, in fact, that Solomdiga did not have time to lower his spear or pull his knife. Now, what Indiga should have done was cast his spear to try to get the tiger to break off its charge and to save his brother. That's what he should have done. What he did, in fact, was he fell to his knees and he covered his head and he begged the tiger to leave him alone. And suddenly it grew quiet. And when he had enough courage to do so, he raised his head, and the tiger was gone. And so was Solomdiga. Indiga called out for his brother. But the only response he got was the echo of his own voice on the mountains. Solomon diga ga 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 ga. And then Indiga began to weep and to castigate himself. How could I have done this? How could I have lost my brother? How will I ever wipe this shame from my face? How will I tell my kinfolk? What will I say to our mother? And he wept and wept until he could weep no more. And then he decided that as their mother needed to eat, he should continue the hunt. And also perhaps because he did not want to face his mother. So he went on hunting. He went on until he came to one of their trap lines. And in one of the traps, there was a weasel. But when the weasel saw Indiga coming, the weasel said, "You brother loser, you hare heart, you rabbity hare heart." And the weasel chewed its own leg off and limped into the forest to die. And Indiga went on. He came to where he had set a snare, and there was a polecat in the snare. And the polecat, when he saw Indiga coming, said, "You brother loser, you are not fit to take me as prey." And he shook the snare to pieces and ran off into the taiga forest. Indiga went on and he shot a goose. His arrow struck the goose right under the wing. But the goose plucked the arrow out of its own breast and threw it at Indiga and said, "I will not give myself as prey to one such as you who loses a brother." And the goose flew off to the middle of a wide river and there dove down and drowned itself. And after that, neither animal nor bird nor prey of any kind would give itself to Indiga. And so Indiga sat down. Indiga pulled out his pipe. And he liked to smoke and think. And so he lit his pipe. He struck a little fire enough to light his pipe. And he lit his pipe and he smoked that pipe. He smoked so much that the whole forest around him was filled with smoke, as though it were filled with fog. And he smoked up all his tobacco, and then he pulled up the dry moss around him, and he smoked that. And after he'd smoked all that, he thought to himself, if I were to lose my pipe or my knife, I would go and look for it. I have lost my brother, Solomdiga. My heart is troubled. I must go and look for my brother. And if I can find my brother, my heart will no longer be troubled. And if I die looking for him, well, then my problems will also be over. And with that decision made, he went home. And he threw himself on his knees in front of his mother, and he told her the whole story. He didn't leave anything out, including how he had found when danger threatened, and he had not the heart of a man, but the rabbity heart of a hare beating in his breast. He told her that, and he wept, and his mother cradled his head in her hands, in her lap, and she stroked his hair, and then she kissed his head, and she said, "You did not listen to your father's instructions. You did not look where your brother was looking. You did not protect your brother. And you found that instead of the heart of a man, you have the heart of a hare. Now you must go find your brother, and you will need to find the heart of a man to bring him back to us." And the next morning early, Indiga left. He took with him his pipe and his knife and his fire kit with its steel striker. He didn't know which way to go, so he chose west, thinking that might be the best direction. And he walked, And he walked to the west for a long time. Eventually, he encountered a snake. And he asked the snake if the snake had any news of his brother Solomdiga. But the snake knew nothing. And so Indiga walked on. Eventually, he came to a mouse. A mouse sees from a little higher perspective than a snake. And he asked the mouse, but the mouse, she also knew nothing of Solomdiga. And then he found a squirrel, climbs up in the trees, and he asked the squirrel, but she also had no news of Solomdiga. He walked on till he came to a river, and he asked the fish if they knew where his brother was, but the fish had no answers for him. And he continued on, and he found a frog, and the frog too knew nothing of Solomdiga. And then he asked a wren, because a wren can fly. He might have a better perspective. But the wren had no news. So he asked the crane. The crane flies higher than the wren. The crane didn't know, but the crane said, "It is the eagle that flies highest of all. Ask the eagle." And so Indiga sought out the eagle. And when he asked the eagle if he knew how to find Solomdiga, the eagle said, "You will have to walk a long, long way to find your brother. He is far, far away. And you will need to face 7 fears before you find him. And the help I can give you is this." And the eagle plucked a feather from himself, and he set that feather floating on the wind. And the eagle said, "Follow this feather wherever it leads, and it might take you to your brother." And then the eagle turned and flew away. And the feather began to lead westward, and Indiga began to follow it. And so Indiga began to follow the feather. The feather went straight west, inexorably west. Now the feather didn't go along roads. It didn't go along paths. It didn't even follow along deer trails. It just went straight west. And Indiga had to follow wherever it led. It led him for a long time over rough terrain. It led him over 3 brooks. And eventually, he crossed the 3 brooks, and he came to a river that was too wide to cross. It was too wide to cross, much like this river out here. He couldn't just ford it. And the feather flew right over that river. And Indiga built himself a little boat, a little raft, and he made his way out into that river. This was the first obstacle. He made his way out into that river, and he noticed something, that the water in that river was boiling, that steam was rising off that river, and that the fish in that river had been boiled alive, and they floated to the surface, their white bellies turning up, their dead eyes looking to him. And it made his heart beat fast and his hands shake. And Indiga said to himself, "This is not the real fear. The real fear is yet to come." And so he noticed his boat falling apart in that boiling water. And seeing that he would be boiled alive, he paddled hard. He paddled back to the near shore, and there, extending out over the shore, there were some branches. There were some big trees there on the shore, and their branches extended out over the water. And he took his bow. He took his bow and he put it between 2 of the branches. And then he knocked an arrow. And he pulled the bowstring back and he hooked it on a twig. And then he grabbed that arrow and took his knife and he cut away that twig. And he shot himself on his arrow across that river. As he flew across that river, he was scalded by the steam rising over him. But the arrow carried him to the far shore, and he stood up, and though badly scalded, he said, well, never mind, that will heal. And the feather led him on through there, over 3 brooks, and over 3 hills. It led him to a place, a gap between 2 mountains. And as he approached that gap between the 2 mountains, Indiga saw lining the trail along there human bones and human skulls. And as he drew near that gap in the mountains, he saw that in that gap there was a den of tigers. The tigers, some of them were fighting amongst themselves. They were pawing at each other and snarling and fighting over bits of meat, and some were rubbing their big heads together in the way those big cats do. There were so many tigers, there were as many tigers in that gap as there are bees in a beehive, and their roaring sounded like thunder itself. And the feather didn't stop. The feather went right through that gap amongst the tigers. Solemn Diga stopped for a moment and considered the situation. And he felt his heart begin to race a bit. And he thought, if I go in amongst those tigers, they will surely tear me to pieces and eat me. And he thought, well, the best thing to do might be to smoke a pipe, because it might be the last smoke I ever enjoyed. So he sat down and he pulled out his fire kit and he struck up enough fire to light a pipe, and he lit that pipe and he had a smoke. And as he was smoking and thinking about what he had to do, he felt something in his hand. It was his steel fire striker. And it gave him an idea. He began to gather dry grass from all around and to braid that grass together into long braids. And he gathered up some fire fungus, some chaga, and he mixed that in with the braids. He tied that in, and then he began to braid all those braids into his own hair until he had a huge braid of dried grass and tinder fungus in his hair. And then he took his fire striker and his flint, and he struck a little fire, and he lit those braids on top of his head so that it looked like he had a giant bonfire coming out of his head. And then he picked up his spear and his things, and he walked right through that gap in amongst the tigers. Now the tigers didn't see a man, they didn't smell a man, they saw fire. And they smelled fire. And those tigers backed away from that fire. And they pounded the earth with their tails, and their red mouths roared at that fire, but they backed away. And as he went through that gap, he thought to himself, surely this is not the fear. The real fear is to come. And he went through to near the end of that gap, and when he got near the end of that gap, he took his spear and he killed one of those tigers. And he drank that tiger's blood, and he took some of the tiger meat and he skinned that tiger and brought the skin with him. And when he got through on the other side of the gap, the eagle feather was waiting for him, but it didn't wait long, and it continued on its journey west, and he continued following it. He walked for a long time following that feather, still going due west over whatever the territory was. He crossed over 3 brooks and 3 hills, but eventually he came to a place where there was a dense forest, a forest where the branches all sort of intertwined and vines grew up amongst the tree. That forest had this property. It would allow animals through it, but not human animals, not human beings. And as he drew near that forest, he could see human remains in various stages of decomposition hanging in the branches of that forest. and the feather flew right through that forest. And Indiga felt his heart beat and his brow sweat and his hands began to shake. But then he said to himself, this is not the real fear. The real fear is yet to come. And he put that tiger skin over his body. And he had the tiger meat skewered on his spear. And he went into that forest. And as he did, the branches of the trees began to reach down like arms and hands to grab him. And when he saw the branches reaching down for him, he took some of that tiger meat and he threw it to them. And smelling the meat, the branches reached for that. And the branches began to fight over the meat and clatter together. And sticks and dead wood began to fall all around him out of the woods. And he picked up the sticks as he went, thinking to himself, when I get the chance, I'll light a cheery little fire with this dry wood. And he made his way through that forest with the tiger skin over him, throwing meat to the grasping branches. And when he got on the other side of that forest, the feather was waiting for him. But it didn't wait long. It continued on his journey west. And it took him across 6 brooks and across 6 rivers and over 6 hills. And it came to a dismal swamp. The kind that would suck a man straight down into the mire. But the feather didn't go around the swamp. The feather went right through the middle of the swamp. Now remember, Indiga was carrying the firewood. And so he decided that the best thing to do was to put some of the wood down and step on those sticks. And before the sticks could sink in, he would put more sticks down in front of him and step on those and then pick up the other sticks behind him and lay them down. Laying down sticks, picking them up, laying down sticks, picking them up. He continued west into that swamp for a long way. It was tough going. And when he got deep into that swamp, he saw someone. It was a strange little hunchbacked man. And what was strange about him is that instead of 2 legs extending out of his trunk, he had 1 big leg. And instead of 2 arms, he had 1 big arm. And though Indiga had never seen this being, this man before, he knew from the stories of his people who it was. It was Boko. Boko, the swamp man. And Boko, the swamp man, had no use for human beings other than to lead them into the swamp and trick them and lose them there to die. And Indiga felt his heart beating, his heart racing, and he felt sweat on his brow, and his arms and legs began to shake. But he said, this is not the real fear. The real fear is yet to come. And so he put on a brave voice, and he said, hey, Boko, I've been looking for you. And Boko said, what is it you want with me? And he said, well, I've heard it said that you can jump higher on your 1 leg than we can jump on 2. And where I come from, I'm the greatest jumper. Nobody can jump higher than me. And I wanted to see if you'd have a jumping contest. And Boko said, all right, let me see you jump. You jump first. And so Indiga found the most solid spot of ground he could, and he put his branches down, and he jumped as high as he could. He was a good jumper. He jumped so his head was almost up in the trees. And when he came down, he landed on those branches, but even though he landed on the branches, he still sunk into the mire up to his waist. And then he pulled himself out, covered with white and brown mud from that swamp. And Boko said, is that what you call jumping? I'll show you what a jump is. And Boko squatted down on his one big leg, and he jumped straight in the air like a flea. His head was up in the clouds. And when he came down, he dove head first into the swamp and was completely buried in the swamp. And now, as soon as Boko jumped, Indiga began to lay down branches and pick them up, and lay down branches and pick them up, and lay down branches and pick them up. And by the time Boko had dug himself out of the mire and cleared his eyes, Indiga was on solid ground on the other side of the swamp and had nothing more to fear from Boko. And Boko said, "Hey, come on now, let's talk more about jumping. Come on, I got some things to show you." And Indiga said, "Oh, I've got an appointment. We'll have to do this another day." And off he ran from that terrible place. On the other side of the swamp, the eagle feather was hovering in the air, waiting for him. And when it saw him, it didn't stop. It didn't give him any time to even wipe the mud from his legs. It just led on to the west, and Indiga followed it. It went over 9 brooks, and over 9 hills, and around 9 lakes. And when they got to the back of the 9th lake, out of that lake, there came a great serpent, a great snake, with scales of stone, shining like rainbows, and that snake was breathing fire, and it coiled itself up in front of Indiga, and it breathed fire on him, and it singed his clothes and burned off his eyebrows. And the snake coiled up to strike, to swallow him, and he felt his heart race, and his legs shake, and he said, "This is not the fear. The real fear is yet to come." And thinking quickly, he reached down and grabbed a stone, and he wiped that white and brown mud from his legs, and he rubbed it on the stone, and he said, "Hey now, friend, before you eat me, you really should have a nice piece of bacon, because bacon makes everything taste better." And he threw that stone right into the snake's maw with its greasy, bacon-colored mud on it, and the snake snatched it, but the stone lodged in the snake's gullet, and the snake couldn't eject the stone, and it couldn't breathe fire, and Indiga beat a retreat out of that place. And the feather was waiting for him there. And it continued going to the west. He walked until his shoes fell apart, and then he walked barefoot, cutting his feet. And after he had crossed 9 brooks, and 9 rivers, and 9 hills, and went through 9 forests, so that he was torn and ragged and bloody-footed, he came to a place where there were strange, oddly shaped standing stones. And as the feather flew in amongst the stones, Indiga followed, and he noticed that as he went in there, the stones turned as if to look at him. And the stones turned to each other and began to talk about him in their stony language.
Uh-oh.
And as he got a little further, he saw a huge, huge man. His head was shaped like a radish. In order to see his head, Indiga had to crane his neck far back. He'd never seen this man before, but he knew from his people's story who this was. It was the mountain man, the man mountain, the giant Kakzamu. Kakzamu would turn human beings to stone. He was the protector of the sacred cliffs, and he had no love for human beings. Indiga felt his heart race, but he told himself, this is not the real fear. The real fear is yet to come. And he said, "Hey, Kaksamu, people where I'm from say You are really powerful and you can do whatever you want. You are very strong. And Kaksamu says, they say correctly. Kaksamu said, I am the guardian of my cliffs. And I protect them from you human beings. I turn humans into stone. And he reached over and touched Indiga's arm. And instantly it was turned from living flesh into cold stone, hanging heavily from his shoulders. And Indiga said, that's a good trick. You know, my old grandfather, who's long dead, he could do that same trick. He could turn living flesh into stone, but he was very powerful. Not only could he turn living flesh into stone, he could turn stone into living flesh. Are you powerful enough to do that, Kaksamu? Kaksamu said, I do what I please. I will show you. And he reached over and touched his stone arm, and again he felt the blood pouring through it, turning it into living flesh. And Indiga said, now, would you like me to tell you the secret that my grandfather took with him to his grave? And Kaksamu was wildly curious, and so he bent down to hear the secret, and Indiga climbed up on his massive shoulders as if to speak into that giant ear, and he noticed Kaksamu's nostril, as big as a fist, was right there. And so he pulled his tobacco pouch out, and he emptied the whole contents of the tobacco pouch up Kaksamu's nostril. And Kaksamu began to sneeze and sneeze and sneezed away all his strength and could do nothing but sneeze. And while he was sneezing, Indiga ran out of that place to the west. And there the feather was waiting for him once again. The feather was waiting, and he followed it. He walked for a long time. His feet were bloody. His clothes were nearly gone to tatters. His belly was so thin that his navel was becoming irritated on the inside from rubbing on his backbone. Still he walked. He walked over one brook and over 3 hills and over 6 rivers and through 9 forests. And he continued to walk. He walked on until one day he came to a place where there was a wall. Now this wall reached so high into the clouds that its top could not be seen. And it was so broad in both directions that it circled the entire earth. And it was so thick, so sheer, of pure, hard stones that it was completely impenetrable. And the feather went right to that wall, and when the feather touched the wall, the feather turned to dust and disappeared, leaving him there. And that's where we will leave him for now.
Okay.
Okay. So where were we? I think we were up against the wall, as I recall.
Yeah.
If you remember, he'd gone through all those things. Boiling rivers, dens of tigers, grasping tree forests, swamp man, snakes. He'd gone through stone giants, all of that. He'd walked and walked and walked. Countless brooks and hills and rivers and forests and mountains he'd gone over, following that eagle feather, always following that eagle feather to the west. And you remember that eagle feather came up and there was a huge wall. A wall with no top, it was so high, and no end, it was so wide. A wall that was sheer and straight and thick and impenetrable. And the eagle feather pit on that wall, and that eagle feather that he followed, his only guide to find his brother, shattered, disappeared into dust, and left him there alone. And he cried out, "No! No! I will not go back! I will not go back! My people do not turn around. My people do not go back. I will cut the hair heart out of my breast." And he drew his knife. And he was about to plunge the knife into his chest and cut out his own heart and end it all. And just before he plunged the knife in, he noticed something he hadn't seen before in the wall. There was a door.
Oops.
And he thought to himself, after all I've been through, after all I've seen, who knows what terrors lie on the other side of this door? But then he felt something change in his chest. Something change in his heart. It started beating. The heart of a man started beating in his chest. And he said, "What do I have to fear? I am a man." And with that, he kicked in that door. And he crouched down low as he went through it, ready for whatever would approach him. And what he saw on the other side of that door was a lovely forest with some red lilies in bloom, blazing like a fire. And he also saw that the wall that had been now behind him simply disappeared. And he also saw his brother, Solomdiga, standing there. And Solomdiga was holding the hand of the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. She had yellow eyes, and she had a wedding dress on that was yellow, and it had black stripes, like the stripes of a tiger. And Solomdiga greeted his brother. And the woman spoke up, and she said, "I am the tiger that took Solomdiga. I fell in love with him, and so I took him. And I got permission from the master tiger to transform myself into your human form so that I could be with him. And now that I know that the Undege people are a brave people with the hearts of men, which are much like the hearts of tigers, I know I can live with you easily." And so they all went back together. It was the same forest that he had lost Solomdiga. It was not far from their home. And they went back to their home, and they greeted their mother, and Solomdiga and the tiger woman was married. So the Udege people and the tiger people are now blood relatives. That's how that was. Now you know, there was a little grass snake that lived near the mother's house, and when they recounted the whole story, the snake took that story with it. And it was carried by the snake people for many years, and that's why you may notice so many quick twists and turns in the story, because it has a snake-like movement. But one year, many generations of snakes after that, a snake carrying that story shed its skin, and it shedded the story with it. And the story might have disappeared, but a mouse came and it gnawed on that skin. It gnawed on it to make a little nest, use it as nesting material, and the story went into the mouse. And so it was carried by the mouse people. And the mouse people are great ones for detail, and that's why there are so many amazing details in the story. And it was carried by the mouse people for many generations of mice, and you know how mice breed. Maybe thousands upon thousands of generations of mice carried the story. But one year, a mouse was swimming across a brook, and a pike came up and took that mouse. And the story went into the pike people, and it was carried down into the depths of the rivers and the lakes by the pike people, which gives the story its depth. And it might have remained there, except one year an eagle came and took a young pike And it ate that pike, and the story went into the eagle people. And it was carried up into the sky, circling and circling around by many generations of eagles. One year, an eagle feather of a descendant of that eagle came to me. And when I grasped that eagle feather, the story went into me. And now I've told you.
Oh.